All right, welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nick Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as manufacturing and engineering. We offer 3 engagement models, which are project-based, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to thefdagroup.com and check us out and get in touch. Today, I am speaking with Mark Shapiro. Mark, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's great to be here. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about resourcing in clinical operations, and there's 4 areas we're going to be talking about. One is the CRO space, one is the FSP space, the third being consultants and contractors, and then full-time employees. So how to decide what solution or combination of solutions is going to work best depending on each company's different situation. But before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. So I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm a management consultant focused on pharmaceutical and life sciences. My company is called Pharma Initiatives. We're a small consulting group. We help companies in pharma, biotech, and the CRO space, as well as clinical technology companies with primarily growth and transformation initiatives. I've been in the industry about 20 years. After graduate school, I moved from the lab into clinical operations and clinical development. I spent time in CROs, biotech, pharma. I worked with Rob Califf at Duke for a few years, and then I went back to business school, got an MBA, became a management consultant focused on growth and transformation in the life sciences, working with a number of large companies, including Amgen, Celgene, Genentech, Onyx, Seprecor, amongst others. And then I helped launch what became a global oncology-focused CRO. We grew that business to about 1,000 employees before selling it to a private equity group. And then after that, I went back into management consulting, formed my own firm with Gary Tyson. Gary was the life sciences partner at Syneos Health Consulting, leading clinical development and medical affairs.
Very cool. Yeah, you and I had worked together, and I remember how amazed I was at how knowledgeable you were and how young you were at the same time. So it's pretty impressive. I said, who is this guy and why is he so smart and so young? So that was obviously why we wanted to talk to you about this. So I did talk a little bit about the different models. So maybe just kind of starting at, the highest of high points, do you want to talk a little bit about, what are those different models? And I know we collaborated on a white paper together, and in that paper talked about some of the positives and negatives for each of those 4 categories. So maybe we can start there.
Sure. So, I think anybody in this industry knows just how exceptionally vast the outsourcing business has become in pharma research and development. I think the industry, like the outsourcing piece of the industry, began really right here in North Carolina about 35 years ago, and which is why most CROs either are headquartered here or have operations down here. But the kind of project-based CRO model is just one of many that seem to exist. And CROs, of course, started introducing what they call FSP, or functional services provider relationships, which have become very common. And then, of course, probably the most dominant but least recognized is just the consultant and contractor basis. So you really have 3 models. And I would say that in my experience with most pharma and biotech now, they make use of all 3 in different capacities. So people are doing projects.
3 from an outsourcing perspective, because I would say the 4th is bringing on full-time employees. So when I look at a clinical study, I'm saying should I outsource? If so, there's 3 different models, but then you can't, there's also that fourth category, which is, would it make sense for me to hire a full-time person?
Of course, right. I was thinking of the employees have always been there in pharma and biotech, but the staffing models just continue to grow and evolve. When I was working with Amgen, they were really pioneering the functional services provider model, which I think had been driven there by a guy named Adrian Ott, who had come from Pfizer and had pursued it at Pfizer. Is about 15 to 20 years ago. But yeah, it really is a mix, and I think the organization size is part of it, but you really find, I think, in most companies now some combination of the 3 or the 4 if you include employees.
So, how would you describe each of the categories, and how would you summarize what people should consider when they're thinking about which model would be best, or again, like I alluded to earlier, hybrid of models?
Well, I think, in recent years, the employee model, which has often been considered preferable, especially for sort of key strategic positions in pharma and biotech, has been difficult because the labor market is tight, and that's not just in the U.S., but globally, it's a tight labor market for high-skilled pharmaceutical executives, technically skilled professionals down the line. And so, I think because of that, companies have been, in part looking for that high technical skill piece from contractors and consultants. And then at the same time, because so much of the R&D portfolio is happening in biotech, they don't have the scale for it to make sense to implement, or employ full permanent functional services, right? So for them, they do a lot of project outsourcing, and where you kind of see the intersection of those two is in the functional model, where most companies, if they don't have an employee overseeing an outsourced provider, they need some level of expertise to understand what it is they're buying, make sure that they're actually getting what they pay for. And so that role is sometimes now filled not just by employees, but by contractors. And then you don't really start to see functional service relationships until companies get to a more mid-sized level. I think in the small organization, they do try to minimize the number of vendors because, being small and being constrained by personnel, it is certainly hard to manage more vendors. And so that's why they tend to stick to a small number of project-based outsourced relationships.
Yeah, my thought, obviously coming from CROs in the past, are kind of what you said. It's good when you're kind of entering into the clinical space for the first time and you're essentially a virtual company and don't have a lot of internal support. And so it just makes sense to say, hey, let me pick a CRO that can kind of handle everything. And then it seems to me, as you kind of get more and more clinical studies under your belt, and perhaps you've, brought another employee on that has a lot of, clinical management experience, then you can start looking at functional service providers. Now, what are some of the different functional service providers that, are out there?
Well, I think in terms of, sorry about the background noise.
No worries. I think we're all dealing with barking dogs nowadays.
Right. It is almost mandatory. I think for functional provider relationships, a lot of it started with areas where, some expertise is required, but they tend to be viewed a little bit more as commodities. Most notably, right, data management was kind of the first area for the functional outsourcing relationships. And now you tend to see it in, kind of what they call biometrics, sort of data management and stat programming, and safety, right? Global pharmacovigilance tend to be two big areas for functional outsourcing. There was a real trend, again, led by Pfizer some years ago, towards even functional outsourcing in clinical operations and monitoring. But that has been pulled back a little bit. They received a 483 for inadequate oversight of their vendor because they were outsourcing to somebody who was then subcontracting out to thousands of freelancers. And being sort of a big player, there was some concern about the quality oversight and the consistency in that model. So, at least in ClinOps, it's come back to more of a, less of a functional provider and more of a project level thing. But certainly in data management and safety and biostats, a lot of functional provider relationships. And of course, all the big CROs provide it, but there are also specialty groups.
Yeah. So just thinking, for a smaller company, virtual, entering in the clinical, what would be your advice about considering maybe hiring a CRO for certain parts of the study and then looking at FSPs and blending them together? Do you think that, what are some of the positive things that you could see coming out of that? What are some of the negative things? And then what would be your overall recommendation?
Well, I think for small companies, it's important to first make sure that you have enough internal expertise, including using consultants, to successfully outsource anything, and finding providers. I think for small companies, one of the great risks they have is assuming that, the CRO that says that they can do anything, or, in some cases, they even, small companies assume because a CRO is big that they can do anything, are quite mistaken in that. And, those sorts of relationships often don't work out great, which is, of course, why there's also a large market of mid-sized CROs and specialty CROs, and sort of functionally oriented CROs. But, for small companies, I think the FSP model is hard until you have, some level of expertise in place. And I would say that, it is important for these companies now, even small ones, to have greater control over their data. And so the FSP model has started to make more sense for small companies, because what tends to happen is if you do project level outsourcing on a program to different vendors, there ends up being a lot of hidden costs down the line if the program is successful, with trying to integrate across different data standards. So, we have definitely seen more small companies trying to take more ownership of data. And so moving towards, kind of small functional provider relationships, where they may, take on more ownership, at least of the systems and oversight of safety and data management, even if they're using some outsourced resources to operate in their system. And, there can be long-term cost savings from that, certainly with consistency, but also with quality. Having lots of different vendors doing things different ways is not a recipe for quality.
Yeah. What do you, because again, in my mind, I'm saying, look, this is my first time getting into a clinical study. I don't want to play a whole lot of games, especially because I'm new to the area. I'm going straight to the CRO, right? But what is that line of demarcation? How would you define that line of demarcation where you say, all right, once I've, insourced X, or I've hit a certain point, it would really make sense for me to take a serious look at FSPs? What is that point?
Well, I usually think that in that sort of first in human phase 1 type setting, where you don't really know where the program is going to go. I mean, obviously you have hopes and you have ideas, but things can go in a lot of different directions, and there's not much scale there. Those things are very suitable either to do fully in-house, like by bringing the resources in, even as contractors, or fully outsourcing it to a project level CRO with the appropriate oversight. And then if you're looking at going into a phase 2 program where you'll have more diversity and expect to do more studies, then it's going to make sense to implement systems, processes for consistency in how you do things. And so, if it's going to be a big phase 2 program with multiple studies, it can certainly make sense to standardize your data management. On the safety side, definitely program level safety makes a lot of sense. With the way the regulations have evolved in the US and Europe, you really need to look across every study, every indication where you're studying some compound. And so breaking that up at the project level has, definitely seen that diminish, but it's just hard. It's hard because now you've got a bunch of different vendors who have to talk to each other about safety events in order to try and do any kind of integrated trend analysis. And that's, hard to coordinate and expensive. And certainly from a quality standpoint, again, there's lots of ways that can break down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So we know, the CRO is an option. We know where FSPs can come into play and be beneficial. What are some of the points of consideration that companies should have when they're considering bringing on consultants and contractors under their lead?
What considerations they should have bringing on consultants and contractors?
So I'm running a clinical study, or I'm planning on doing it, and I have CRO as an option, FSP as an option, bringing on consultants and contractors, and then just insourcing the whole thing and bringing on full-time employees. So now that we've gone from kind of CRO to FSP, I want to investigate consultants and contractors. What are the deciding factors that would lead a company to say, I think rather than hiring a CRO, FSP, or maybe I'm doing both, but for a certain segment of the clinical study, I think we should bring on consultants and contractors. What is that, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think for companies that have venture-backed type funding structures, or they may have achievement milestones, you really don't want to commit as much to full-time employees and building infrastructure. So you need to have flexibility, to scale up and scale down, even, month to month, project to project. One thing that has always impressed me about our industry, Nick, and I think is very challenging is, these are high-risk projects, and, portfolio prioritization changes constantly. And so, the certitude that what you're working on right now is a priority, will it still be a priority in 6 months? That's just hard to plan for, right? External factors can change, regulatory delays, manufacturing delays, new results from other companies. So, you really need to build in a lot of flexibility into your workforce. And flexibility and scalability are just, you can't do that with in-house employees in this environment. It's simply, even for big companies, it's close to impossible.
Yeah. So how do I understand the idea about flexibility? How does a company know the importance of flexibility? How does a company, because again, now where my mind's going is, I have to decide, let's say I'm putting CRO and FSP over to the side, and I'm deciding, okay, I need these individuals, and I'm trying to decide, should they be an employee or should they be a consultant and contractor, right? And obviously I understand the point with flexibility, but I want to go a little bit deeper and try to understand, at what point should I draw the line and say, nope, that has to be an employer, nope, it really is in my best interest to maintain that flexibility with the consultant and contractor.
Yeah, well, I think if you're looking at your resourcing in a growing biotech company strategically, you really want to avoid um, paying to train up external people that aren't committed to your organization, right? So, for some of these key roles, and they can be key operational or scientific roles, you really want, even if it's like contractor consultant to permanent, you want to bring in the know-how. And, as you do studies and learn things and build relationships with sites and investigators, you really don't want to pay the CROs to get that training and expertise on your behalf, right? So for those key things where it's IP strategy, relationships, you want to have a plan of growing your internal workforce towards maintaining that expertise in-house, right? Because if the person who has all the site relationships is at a CRO and they decide to switch CROs, it's not easy for you to follow them, right? And you've just spent a lot of money on studies making that person an expert on the thing that you need to be an expert at. So that human capital strategy is really important. And I think the sort of functional provider thing is a bridge along that pathway, right? That as you become an expert on setting up databases and designing studies in a particular therapeutic area, and if you're doing novel work, eventually you're going to be the expert, not the CRO, right? If you're doing something that the CRO's done 100 times before, your whole program is not very novel, right? But if you're doing novel science, right, in a biotech company, you shouldn't expect that the CRO is really an expert on something where you're the only person who's ever done it before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so everything you learn in that process, you want to consolidate that learning internally as quickly as you can. So that's really the balance between flexibility and consolidation.
What are some of the questions that these companies should be asking themselves when making these types of decisions?
Well, I think, at a core group, if you look at how these things expand, you really want to ask, where are the kind of risks in your program? And, wherever those are risk, those are the things that you really need to develop your expertise around, right? And if it's, manufacturing risk with the program, right? Some compound that has complex manufacturing, like a CAR T program, right? You really need to internalize a lot of expertise, even if you contract out the actual manufacturing production, right? You can't afford to lose that expertise. Similarly, if it's something with, complicated statistical design, or let's say a rare disease where the relationships with the investigators and the patient groups are really important, you want that person to be a sponsor employee or a contract with a goal of growing, with a successful program into making that person an employee. Just because so much of the value creation along your development is being created through those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every program kind of differs in what are the sort of, what are the novelties of that program and what are the risks, and those are the things you want to make sure that you really, zealously guard the intellectual assets that are created.
Yeah, good point. You and I have come from the clinical world, and or you're still in the clinical world, but into a different degree. And we've seen a lot of issues in clinical research, a lot of people making poor decisions and having to deal with some pretty serious issues. What are some of the common pitfalls that occur when people pick the wrong model, and how would you advise them to put themselves in a position not to fall into one of those pitfalls?
You know, one of the truisms in this business, right, is that the one thing that you can't get more of is time, right? And so, you often see with companies that they lose time. They don't move with urgency with some of these key things. And, you know, with any of these decisions, you have companies that maybe they want internal expertise, but they've decided to set a parameter that has to be an employee. And, with highly specialized expertise, a lot of consultants or people that might even be interested in being an employee can't necessarily wind up all their commitments right away. And so by not deciding or not being flexible about some of these things, they give up a lot of time, right? And I've seen that now at a number of small clients where they spend a lot of time looking for the perfect person for some role. And in the process, they've left the role vacant for a year. And, a year in a development plan for an asset is forever, right? That, not having a key employee for a year is a huge mistake. And so if you have to fill that, in a fractional sense, you really should. And, I think that's the other thing that, sometimes small companies aren't willing to fill things, with fractional resources, but there's a lot of roles where, regulatory or stats, there isn't a full-time workload, right? There's short, intense periods followed by, spaces of sort of idle or low intensity, and those roles don't make sense to fill with employees right away. It's a good thing to get to the scale where they do, but you need to have expertise there, and you need to have flexibility around those roles.
Yeah, and it, certainly as it pertains to time, let's say I know I need an employee in a particular role. My experience has been is that it's a lot easier to bring on a consultant relatively quickly that's qualified while I'm trying to find that perfect fit for the employee, right? So, and we know how long these searches can go. Generally speaking, you want to say maybe 3 months, but it could be 6, 12 months until you find that perfect person, depending on your level of scrutiny. So if we understand that time is money and we've got to get things moving, and there's a whole bunch of different other mantras like perfection is the enemy of progress or something. A lot of times these consultants that kind of come in to the organization as a full-time person contributor, they can grease the skids, they can get things moving, they can build a little bit of momentum, and even beyond that, they could help. There's a whole bunch of other things they can help with, because anything that's new is a work in progress, even a job description. So let's say the consultant comes in, and then we say, actually, this job description should be changed, or the expectations for this role should be changed, right? So even there can be a clearer picture about what that role entails. And then let's say we get to a point where we have identified that employee. They're jumping onto a train that's already moving in a good sense, not that they have to jump onto a train and put themselves at risk, but there's already momentum, and that consultant can actually help train them, can help fill them in on the aspects. This is really running well, this has some issues, you want to make sure that you're focusing on that. So I think even as kind of an interim solution to bringing on full-time employees would be to bring on different consultants and contractors and not fall victim to, I have to have everything absolutely perfect before we start, moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it, Nick. And, it is in this, the way the job market exists, both in the US and Europe, the contractor or consultant route is a good way to determine whether or not that person really has the expertise that you need. And, for both parties to make sure that it's the right fit. and you see it a lot in this business. People have the right expertise or the wrong fit, especially moving between like CRO and pharma, or between, large pharma and small biotech. That those types of adjustments actually can be harder for people to succeed in, even if they have the right qualifications. And so for both parties, it's important to see, and make sure that you have the opportunity to evaluate that. And that's just, it's smoother and more efficient in the kind of contract to permanent model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so I think this has been really good. As I, think about kind of wrapping up this idea of moving into clinical research and deciding CRO, FSP, consultant, contractor, and full-time employee, what would you say would be some of the kind of the final thoughts, or most important things that you'd want to leave the audience with to consider as they stop watching this podcast?
Yeah, I think that probably one of the big challenges that I see out there is that it's sometimes hard for organizations to recognize that even the process and ability to hire and find qualified resources, contractor or consultant, is its own specialized expertise. And that, they sometimes are not willing to bring in help even for that. And, I have actually worked with biotech companies where, and CROs where they literally established formal relationships with people, recruiters, recruiting firms, to fill the role of recruiting for them because they realized that they couldn't meet the needs on their own. And so, I think it's part of this is recognizing what you don't know, and be willing to, and I think this is the mark of all good leaders, right, is to be willing to listen to and bring in expertise, whether it's different expertise or complementary expertise, to help you move quickly and to help weigh some of these trade-offs, which, frankly, none of this is easy, right? Balancing time and cost and, quality in staffing and delivery is very hard.
Yep. Awesome. Well, Mark, thank you very much for joining and providing this awesome feedback. And for everybody else, if you find these conversations valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates on new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about a project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.